Rez Dogs by Joseph Bruchac. Chapters 1 through 4. Chapter 1, Malsum. When Malian woke up and looked out her window, the dog was there, just as she had dreamed it would be. It was lying on the driveway halfway between their small house and the road. It wasn't sleeping, its head was up, its ears erect, its paws in front of it as if on guard. As Malian watched, the dog turned its head to look right at her, as if it knew her, as if it had known her for a long, long time. "Malsum," she said, "Kwai, kwai, nidoba. Hello, hello, my friend." The big dog nodded and then turned back to continue watching the road. Malsum, that was the old name for a wolf. It was a good one for that dog. It was as big as a wolf. It looked like the videos of wolves she'd watched on her phone. The only things different about it were the white spots over each of its eyes. "Four-eyed dog," a soft voice said from back over her shoulder. It was Grandma Frances. Malian had not heard her come up behind. She was used to that. Both her grandparents could walk so softly that she never knew they were there until they spoke. Grandma Frances would tease her about it. "Be careful, granddaughter. You don't want to let no Indian sneak up on you." Grandma Frances put her hand on Malian's shoulder. "Looks to me like he thinks he belongs here," she said. Then she chuckled. "Or maybe like he thinks he owns this place." "Would that be okay?" Malian said. Grandma Frances chuckled again. "It seems to me it's not up to us. When a dog like that just appears and chooses you, it's not your decision." "Can I go outside and see what he does?" Malian said. "Let's ask your grandpa. Roy, get in here." But Grandpa Roy was already there. "I've been listening to every word. Seems to me if you step outside and then move real slow, whilst you watch what he does, you'll be okay. But just in case, I'll be right behind you." Malian shook her head. "Remember what they said? You and Grandma should not go outside. It's too dangerous. You might get that virus. That's why I can't go home to Mom and Dad." "And we're gosh darn lucky you're here with us," Grandpa Roy said. "That old saying about how we don't know what we'd do without you sure makes sense these days. So I'll stay inside, but you stay in too. Just open the door and we'll see what he does." Malian cracked the door. The dog stood up and turned her way. He opened his mouth, let his tongue hang out in what she knew had to be a smile. She held out her wrist. "Malsum," she called, her voice soft but sure. The big dog walked over and sniffed her hand. "Malsum," she said again, dropping down to one knee as she placed her hand on his broad head. The dog looked at her straight into her eyes. As he held her gaze, it seemed to Malian that she could see intelligence and even a hint of humor and a kind of certainty. Malsum nodded his head as if to say, "Yes, that can be my name. I am here for you." Then he licked her fingers before turning around and going back, heavy muscles rippling beneath his skin to drop himself down where he had been. "Guess he is guarding us for sure," Grandpa Roy said. "Looks like you got a new friend." Chapter 2, Rez Dogs. Malsum was lying on his back, his tongue hanging out as Malian rubbed his stomach. She was thinking about how cool it was that their names sort of sounded the same. Even though his meant wolf and hers was just the way her old Pennacook people who didn't use the sound of L pronounced Marianne. "Yep," Grandpa Roy said, nodding his head. "There's no doubt that he's chosen you." He tapped his long index finger on his chin, a gesture her grandfather often made just before he was to tell a story. The dogs on any reservation, they have their own lives. They have their own tribes. And when we would travel, like when in the spring we used to go and live by the falls where the fish were running, lots of times the dogs would not go with us. They'd stay in the village and take care of themselves. He chuckled. "You know, my Grandpa Red Hawk told me how one time when they'd gone to the falls, he realized that he'd left his best knife behind, and so he went back to get it. He also wondered just what the dogs were doing with all the people gone. So he snuck up to the edge of the village. My grandpa always could move real quiet, and he stayed downwind so they couldn't smell him. So I guess none of those dogs knew he was there when he peeked out from behind a tree. And what he saw was the darndest thing. Those dogs were acting just like people. They'd put on clothes we left behind, and some of them were walking around on their hind legs. Some were sitting around the fire and drinking soup from wooden cups that they dipped into a pot that they had cooking. One of them was even smoking a pipe. Grandpa Red Hawk figured the best thing he could do was just leave those dogs be. So he didn't bother to look for his knife. He just made his way back to the falls. What it showed him was that the dogs could do just fine on their own without us. We humans were lucky they chose to live with us. Or maybe it was the other way around, that we were the ones who chose to live with them. The big dog had sat up when Grandpa Roy started to tell that story. As soon as it was done, he stood, shook himself, and then walked over to Grandpa Roy to put one paw on his lap and look into his face. "Did I get it right?" Grandpa Roy said. Malsum nodded and then went back to lie down in front of Malin. Grandpa Roy smiled. "Yep, our Rez Dogs are not like them you see in the cities. You'll never see our good friend here being walked around on some fancy leash." Malin smiled back at her grandfather. She always loved it when he told her stories. She also smiled because she knew how true it was about the dogs on the Rez being different from those in the city. She noticed that when she was little and made her very first trip to Boston with her parents for her father's interview with that big law firm. She was only 5, but she had to ask, why are all those dogs tied to people like that? Don't they have any lives of their own? How come they're not just allowed to run free? Her dad went down on one knee, put his hands on her shoulders. It's just kind of the way not only the dogs, but the people have to live in the city where they're all so close together. If they're not controlled, they might get hurt or maybe even hurt each other. That was when her mom smiled down at her dad and said, "Well now, Thomas, it seems to me you could say that we are Rez Dogs too." "Woof," Malin said. "Woof, woof, woof." Then all 3 of them started barking and laughing together. No one else walking by understanding why they were barking, maybe not even knowing the 3 of them were Indians. Dad in his suit, Mom in her best jeans, and Malin in her new Catholic school uniform. 3 Rez Dogs in the city. That was how she saw them back then, and saw herself still. Chapter 3, Mail Delivery. Malsum sensed the mailman first as Malin sat with the big dog on the crooked old wooden steps. Her dad had planned to fix those steps after he and her mother got back from the city. But that was before they had to shelter in place in the city, and Malin's weekend visit to her grandparents on the Rez got stretched out way, way longer. A deep growl started in Malsum's throat, then he stood up and walked stiff-legged to stand at the end of the walk by the mailbox, 30 feet from their front door. He didn't move as the truck pulled up and a red-haired man in a uniform started to get out. But he stopped as Malsum's growl got louder. "Call off your dog," the man yelled, then started coughing. Malin stayed where she was, and ahead of her now, so did Malsum. The mailman wiped his nose on his sleeve, then held up a box. "I got a package you need to sign for." "Thank you, Mr. Malin called to him, but whatever it is, I don't think I need it. I also think that maybe what you need now is to go see a doctor." The mailman started coughing again. When it stopped, he nodded. "Kid, you might be right." Then he smiled, held up his hand. He took a pen from his shirt pocket and scribbled something on the piece of paper stuck to the top of the box. "Guess what?" he said. "It looks to me like you already signed for this." He balanced the package on top of the mailbox. "I'll go by the clinic today." He coughed as he slid back behind the wheel. "You and Killer there take good care of Roy and Martha Francis. Tell 'em Al said hi." Malin waited on the steps until the truck was out of sight, and the big dog came back to her side. Then she put on the vinyl gloves from the box inside the door, pulled out some tissues from the baby wipe dispenser before getting the package. It had been sent by her parents, of course. She wiped it down on every side before opening it. "Bears always have to have their sweets," read the note her mom had written. "So these are for your grandparents, and you are sweet, sweet girl." Inside were 8 packages of the cookies that she and her grandparents loved. Her father's words written on the back of her mother's note were in smaller print, but they were even sweeter. Mallian, you are the best daughter and granddaughter in the whole wide world. We miss you so much, but we're glad you're there. That's the way our Creator meant it to be, that one day, young people might know the blessing of being able to take care of those who cared for them when they were young. Give them a hug from both of us. We'll all be together soon. Malsum looked up quizzically, as if he was asking why he had been left out. Mallian knelt and put her arms around Malsum's neck. Don't feel bad, boy. I haven't told them about you yet. She stood up and took her iPhone out. Look at me, she said. Smile for the camera. The big dog looked up, then opened his mouth in a grin so wide it made Mallian laugh. All right, she said, and she pressed send. My mom and dad are going to be glad that we have such a great new friend. Chapter 4. The 3 Muskrateers. Her phone was ringing. She picked it up and looked at the time. It was midnight. Who would be calling her at midnight? Her daily call from her parents had just taken place after dinner. Her grandparents had been in bed for 2 hours already. Hello, she said. Help, replied the voice on the other end. Who is this? It's us, said a sort of familiar voice. It's us, the 3 Muskrateers. It was Darryl Musquas. Of course, Mallian thought. Who else would be calling up this late? He and his 2 best buddies, the Glossian twins, Abel and Mark, started calling themselves that a couple of years ago. Darryl's last name in Wabanaki meant muskrat. Unlike Mallian, the 3 of them had never read Alexander Dumas, but they loved the movie. The 3 of them were not bad kids, but if there was any trouble you could get into around the Rez, they would be knee-deep in it before you could say tabat, stop. Mallian had known those guys since all 4 of them were real little. Whenever she spent time with her grandparents, usually during the summer vacation, those 3 guys were who she almost always ended up hanging out with. Even though she'd been living off Rez since kindergarten, they'd pretty much accepted her, even though Darryl had started the 3 of them calling her Macintosh. Macintosh, the apple, and not the computer. It was a play on the slang word apple, a name for someone who looks Indian but acts more like a white person, red on the outside and white within. An insult to say to somebody native. But they said it good-naturedly, and Mallian was never one to let words hurt her, especially since she knew real well who she was. Why are you calling me at midnight, she asked. Because we need help, Darryl pleaded. What kind of help do you need? Darryl's voice was strained. We need you now, right now, to keep your dog from eating us. We're way up in the old ash tree across the road, and your big dog is here snarling at the base of the tree, jumping up at us and growling like a werewolf. Mallian barely managed to keep herself from laughing out loud. What did you do to make him chase you? There was a long silence from the other end. Then Darryl said, The 3 of us sneaked out of our houses. We came over to your place just to see if maybe you'd like to come out with us. You know, just do something. It's so boring at home. Mallian had to agree that it sure was boring at times. She wished she could hang out with friends, if not the kids she'd gotten to know in her school, then her Pennacook buddies, like the Muskrateers. Would it really hurt to just spend a little time out of the house with them? Then she shook her head. The way things were, she had to be responsible. She couldn't think first about fun like a little kid. Right now, Mallian said, putting on her grown-up voice, at night, in the middle of a pandemic? Aw, Darryl said, come on, Mallian, everybody knows what we've heard on the news. Kids don't get this disease, so isn't it crazy for us to stay all cooped up like chickens? Anyhow, we sneaked up real good, and we were just about to throw some little stones at your window to wake you up when we heard this deep growl. Then your big dog came charging out, and us 3, we barely made it to this tree. This time it was even harder for Mallian not to laugh, but she didn't. Okay, she said, her voice calm. I will go call him, but you have to promise me something. Whatever you ask, we'll do it, Darryl said. Okay, she said. Now, first of all, maybe us kids don't get COVID-19 as bad as adults do, but we can give it to our elders. You 3 guys all have grandparents at home, so you should be ashamed of yourselves. There was an even longer silence. Then Darryl said in a quieter voice, You got a point. You bet I do. Now, if you really agree with me, I'm going to whistle and call our dog back to me, and you three are going to climb down from that tree and go straight home. All right?" There was a long pause, and she could hear a muffled sound like grumbling from the muskrateers, probably muffled because Darrell had his hand over his phone. "Okay," Darrell finally sighed in a resigned voice. "We guess you're right." Mallion whistled, Malsum stood, shook himself, took one last look up the tree, then trotted to her side. "Try not to laugh." Mallion watched as the boys climbed down, then called to them, "Good night."